He ruled the most powerful empire on earth. One wrong word to him could end your career, sometimes your life. And yet the record shows he almost never raised his voice, never defended himself in public, never let another man's insult choose his next sentence. He was trained by the best persuaders in Rome, and then he quietly refused to use any of it against people. Tonight, we find out why that refusal is the reason nobody could ever control him. Picture a war tent on the Danube frontier, somewhere in modern Austria or Hungary, sometime in the 170s AD. Snow outside. A trusted general has just betrayed him. A plague is moving through his own cities. His wife is dying on the road behind him. Any other emperor in Roman history, Nero, Caligula, Domitian, turns a moment like this into someone else's nightmare. This man picks up a pen instead and writes a private note to himself in Greek that no one alive is meant to read. That habit, writing to himself instead of at other people, is the whole story of why he could never be controlled. His name was Marcus Aurelius. Everything you're about to hear is sourced directly from the only writing he ever produced for himself, cross-checked against the standard modern translation by classicist Gregory Hays, and against the two ancient historians who actually wrote about his reign, Cassius Dio and the biographical collection known as the Historia Augusta. No invented quotes, no composite anecdotes. If it isn't in the record, it isn't in this script. This is Mind Exhort. Marcus Annius Verus was born in Rome in the year 121 AD into a family important enough that his birth coincided with his own grandfather's second term as consul, Rome's highest office. His father died when he was a small child, so his grandfather raised him. Here's the part almost nobody expects. The man who would later become famous for saying almost nothing unnecessary was trained from boyhood to be one of the most persuasive talkers in the Roman world. His education followed the standard elite path. Literature first, then rhetoric, the actual currency of power in Rome, exactly as it had been under the Old Republic. He was drilled in speeches, made to argue both sides of invented court cases, made to advise imagined historical figures at their turning points. Should Caesar cross the Rubicon? Should Alexander turn back at the Indus? All of it in two languages, because the Roman upper class was fluently bilingual in Latin and Greek. Then, in 137 AD, when he was 16, everything changed. The reigning emperor, Hadrian, was dying without an heir. Hadrian's first choice of successor had died unexpectedly, so Hadrian restructured the entire succession. He adopted a senator named Antoninus, on the condition that Antoninus adopt this teenage boy in turn. Overnight, a boy being trained for the Senate became a boy being trained for the throne. His tutors were now the best money in the empire could buy. Herodes Atticus for Greek oratory, and Marcus Cornelius Fronto for Latin oratory, a relationship close enough that many of Fronto's actual letters to him survive today. And here's the detail that explains everything that came after. Fronto's own surviving letters record his growing frustration, because his star pupil kept pulling away from rhetoric and toward philosophy instead. The most gifted talker in the Roman aristocracy was quietly walking away from the art of talking to win and walking towards something else entirely, the art of talking to stay whole. In 161 AD, Antoninus died and Marcus became emperor, immediately elevating his adoptive brother Lucius Verus as co-emperor, honoring what he understood to be Hadrian's original intention. For nearly 2 decades, he held the most unaccountable job on the planet, and for almost all of it, the empire was under pressure from every direction. A war with the Parthian Empire in the east, a plague that returned with the legions, Then a decade of brutal, grinding warfare against Germanic tribes on the northern frontier. It was during those final, exhausting years, camped with the army, dealing with the revolt of a trusted general named Avidius Cassius in 175 AD, losing his co-emperor, losing his wife Faustina on the road, that Marcus wrote the private notebooks we now call Meditations. He never titled it. He never intended it for anyone but himself. Scholars believe the oldest surviving Greek manuscript simply called it To Himself. It contains almost no dates and almost no names an outsider would recognize. Long stretches of a man mid-argument with his own mind. It wasn't a book. It was raw material. A man rehearsing self-control in private so he wouldn't lose it in public. And scattered through those private notes are the actual, sourced instructions he gave himself about how to talk to other people. One of the men Marcus credits most is his mentor, Junius Rusticus, a real Roman statesman, twice appointed consul, and one of the most respected Stoic teachers of his generation. According to the Historia Augusta, Marcus respected him so deeply that as emperor, he reportedly greeted Rusticus with a kiss before greeting the commanders of his own guard, and later asked the Senate to honor him with statues after his death, an extraordinary gesture in a court obsessed with rank. In the very first book of the Meditations, Marcus lists, almost like a debt ledger, exactly what he learned from Rusticus: to write plain, direct letters instead of ornate ones. He specifically remembers a plain letter Rusticus once sent from a town called Sinuessa. To steer clear of using rhetoric, poetry, and fine phrasing as a performance. To behave in a conciliatory way toward people who've angered you when they come looking to make peace. And Rusticus is the man who first introduced him to the lectures of Epictetus, the former slave turned philosopher whose ideas about self-control would shape Marcus more than almost anyone else's. There's also an entry about a teacher named Alexander, a grammarian, a man whose entire profession was catching other people's speech errors. What Marcus took from him is almost the opposite of what you'd expect. Not to constantly correct people, not to pounce the moment someone mispronounces a word, but to just answer the actual question, or offer the right example, or address what someone meant instead of how they phrased it. And if you do correct the wording at all, do it so smoothly they barely notice. A future Roman emperor wrote that down as a rule to live by. Being right about something small is not worth making someone else feel small. From a teacher named Diognetus, he records a different discipline entirely: to be able to hear unwelcome truths without flinching, without needing flattery to function. And about his adoptive father Antoninus, the man who trained him for 18 years before handing him an empire, Marcus writes something almost forensic in its detail, that Antoninus never exhibited rudeness, never lost control of himself, never turned violent, that no one ever saw him sweat, that everything he did was approached calmly and decisively, with no loose ends. Marcus even remembers one specific small moment: Antoninus quietly accepting an apology from a customs officer at a town called Tusculum, instead of using his imperial power to humiliate the man. Later, on his own, Marcus reduces an entire theory of conflict to 6 words. The best revenge is not to be like that, not to become the person who wronged you. And in one of the most quietly revealing entries in the whole book, while running an empire under siege on 2 fronts, he reminds himself to speak simply when addressing the Senate, the most politically dangerous room in Rome, not to dazzle them, not to out-argue them, just to speak simply. There's one more line, and it might be the cleanest summary of his entire talking style. Writing to himself, he sets a single filter for everything that comes out of his mouth. If it isn't right, don't do it. If it isn't true, don't say it. Not say it convincingly, not win with it. Just pass it through that filter first and let the rest go.
Here's what all of that adds up to.
And it's worth being precise, because this isn't vague ancient wisdom, it's a specific mechanism. Every person who has ever tried to control someone through words needs one thing to work: a reaction. An insult needs you to feel small. A provocation needs you to snap back. Flattery needs you to need it. The moment you require someone else's opinion of you to regulate how you feel, you've handed them a lever. Marcus was trained by the best rhetoricians in the Roman Empire, and then deliberately built a habit of not using that training to win rooms. Speaking plainly, refusing to correct people for sport, refusing to let insults dictate his next sentence, treating the Senate, an army, and a dying empire with the same level tone he used with a customs officer at Tusculum. That's not passivity. This is a man who fought wars for a decade and ran policy across 3 continents. It's discipline pointed inward instead of outward. A style of speech with no exploitable seams. Nothing to bait, nothing to flatter, nothing to provoke. Because the reaction it's fishing for was never wired into him in the first place. And this wasn't just personal philosophy. It's the same mechanism modern clinical psychology later built an entire treatment model around, from a completely different direction, without initially realizing where it came from. In 1979, the psychiatrist Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, published the field's foundational treatment manual with his colleagues Rush, Shaw, and Emery, and stated plainly that the philosophical origins of cognitive therapy trace back to the Stoic philosophers, naming Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius specifically. Years earlier, the psychologist Albert Ellis had said the same thing about his own model, rational emotive behavior therapy, crediting Epictetus's core idea directly: that people are disturbed not by events themselves, but by their judgments about those events. That is the same discipline Marcus was drilling into himself, alone in a war tent 18 centuries earlier. Separate the event from your interpretation of it, and only the interpretation is yours to control. That's what untouchable actually meant for him, and what it can mean for you. It was never about winning an argument. It was about no longer needing to win one. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, still on campaign on the northern frontier at 58 years old, the first emperor in a century to pass the throne directly to his own son. The notebook he never meant anyone to read survived him by pure accident of history, copied and recopied for 18 centuries until it reached you tonight, still carrying the same private instruction he once gave himself on the Danube. Don't perform. Don't correct people to feel superior. Don't let another person's words choose your next move. Speak simply and let that be the whole weapon. If this is the first time you've heard the real, sourced version of this man, not the quote graphic version, subscribe to Mindsort, because every story here gets built the same way. Dug out of the original record, not recycled from someone else's caption.